sleepy after lunch, so I will try to keep you awake. Maybe I'll ask you to raise your hand and answer some questions or something to keep you awake. So as she said, I work for a consulting firm called AECOM International Development, and we recently finished implementing a 7-year project funded by USAID called Environmental Cooperation Asia, or EcoAsia. And under that project, we worked on lots of water supply, sanitation, environmental enforcement projects in 7 countries in Asia, including the Philippines. And towards the end of the project, we got more into climate change. So we wanted to understand more about what is the situation with climate change for water utilities. So we did a survey in the Philippines and also a survey Asia-wide to get a better idea of the readiness of water utilities to adapt to climate change. So can I have the first slide, please? Okay, there we go. I don't know if you can see it. I hope it's not that too clear. We're going to get one there. So just a quick overview or introduction. So the survey was conducted as part of the USAID EcoAsia project, as I mentioned. We conducted it together with an organization called WaterLinks. WaterLinks is an NGO based in the Philippines, but working Asia-wide on twinning partnerships. We find it's very useful for water utilities to learn from each other. It's peer-to-peer learning. Rather than having an expert giving a lecture, you have 2 water utilities working together, more hands-on, and we find that, especially if it's over a time period of maybe 1 year, then they can have a better learning experience and actually get some impact on the ground in that type of peer learning. So we worked with WaterLinks on this survey. And then we had a workshop last August where we presented the preliminary findings and got some feedback, and then we came out with a study. I have about 30 copies with me today if anyone would be interested in having a copy. And then, as I mentioned, we also did an Asia-wide survey, and we also have a report on that. Both are available on the WaterLinks website if you're interested. So, just in summary, the Philippines study basically found that the water utilities are in usually the early stages or middle stages of climate readiness, which is fairly similar to the findings in Asia, although the utilities in Asia were a little more advanced, so more on the intermediate stages in Asia. So the objectives of the survey were to identify the current levels of readiness to adapt to climate change impacts and define the actions that water utilities could take to adapt and become more resilient to climate change impacts. And we also wanted to understand the capacity needs so that in the future, WaterLinks or Manila Academy or some other groups could provide some capacity building training, workshops for water utilities to better adapt. And we also wanted to document some best practices that the water utilities are implementing. And then, as I mentioned, we have these 20 partnerships, so we also wanted to identify those who have best practices that could be mentors to other water utilities. So the framework, sorry, I'm not telling you to advance the slide. Just 2 more, okay. These are the objectives. 1 more. Okay, whoops. There we go, okay. So the framework that we came up with for the survey was, it's 4 parts. It's basically the process that water utilities would probably go through in trying to address the climate change issue. So the first one is awareness, to understand basic climate science, variability, resilience, and adaptation. So it's for both the staff of the water utility and for the customers. I know we turn the lights on, everyone will fall asleep. But maybe you can see the slides better. I don't know, it's very blurry, sorry. But I think, are the organizers going to make the presentations available on CD maybe later? So the basic first step is awareness, both amongst water utility staff and amongst customers. We all need to become more aware of, how is climate change going to be impacting our water resources, water availability, storms and flooding and things like that. The next step is assessment, doing vulnerability assessment, risk assessment, to try to get a better idea of what those risks are. And then taking that information and planning is the next stage, incorporating climate change impacts into our planning process, including water safety plans. And then implementing action. So what activities can we do to reduce risk, build resilience, and foster adaptation? Next slide, please. So we surveyed 20 water districts, and we did not select them on a scientific basis. We selected them on the basis of those who are more vulnerable to climate change impacts, and also those utilities that we had some relationship with because they had been involved in some water links or EcoAsia projects in the past. Because when you're asking people to fill out a survey, it helps if you know them personally and you can call them on the phone and follow up and encourage them to complete the survey. So these were the water utilities. Most of them were kind of a medium size. I think it's 500 or 50,000 to 70,000 connections, or 10,000 to 50,000 connections. Most of them were in that size range. So next slide, please. The key findings. First of all, we asked them what do they perceive as the most important climate-related risks. What are they most concerned about when it comes to climate change? The number one concern was increased costs. Are we going to have increased power costs, system maintenance costs, and operational costs from damage from typhoons or flooding or drought conditions where we don't have enough water? How is that going to impact our costs? That was the number one concern. The second one was reduced availability of groundwater. That was the second concern. Then the third one was not having enough information about climate change, hydrology impacts, and watershed changes. And the fourth was a concern about increased severity and incidence of floods. And the fourth was changes in the watershed due to climate change. Next slide. So in terms of awareness, assessment, and planning, those first three circles on that framework I showed you, the key findings for those three areas were that none of the 20 water districts that we surveyed were fully climate ready. Most were, like I mentioned, in the more initial stages or intermediate stage of climate readiness. And they felt that that first stage of awareness raising was very important because since this is sort of a new topic, that they felt they needed to invest time and energy in educating their staff and customers and stakeholders such as the LGUs that they deal with about what climate change is all about and how it will impact the water district. So more than 10 of the 20 water districts that were surveyed have already initiated plans to increase awareness, increase understanding. Less than half of the water districts surveyed have taken steps to improve their ability to understand climate and hydrological variabilities and assess risks. Most of them have been relying on outside agencies to do risk assessments or vulnerability assessments or to help them with the more complicated kind of climate science. Only about 30% of the water district surveys have integrated climate factors into their planning processes, but about half, 50%, have worked with government agencies on planning for water resources and wastewater management. Next slide, please. So in terms of actions, most of the water districts that were surveyed have taken no regrets actions. A no regrets action is something that they need to do anyway just for their basic efficiency improvements and operations, but it's something that will also make them more resilient to climate change impacts. So an example of that is reducing non-revenue water. That's something that's good to do anyway, but it's also something that will be very important as climate change impacts increase. We'll have less rainfall is expected to decrease, so we're going to have less water to deal with. So the more water that we can conserve through reducing non-revenue water, the better. Obviously, tapping new sources of water is going to be very important as climate change increases, and upgrading infrastructure, making infrastructure more climate-proof. About 16 of the water districts surveyed have taken actions to protect and monitor their watersheds, which is obviously a good action to take. Most perceived flood protection and control as an LGU or national government mandate, so they didn't feel that it was their responsibility. but about half, or 10 water districts, have already moved some of their facilities to higher ground and installed flood-proof barriers. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Manila Water, built a wastewater treatment plant recently in Marikina. I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago, and they built it up on stilts because Marikina, the area near the river, floods on a regular basis, and they received an award for that, for being climate, as a climate change adaptation action. About 10 of the water district surveys had taken actions to establish or improve disaster management systems. And they saw that involvement of the local government unit was really important for disaster preparedness. Next slide, please. So in terms of good practices, we collected those as part of the survey, and I just want to mention a few of them. And we organized them in these 4 areas that I mentioned. So in terms of awareness, a good practice that was mentioned by San Jose del Monte, Bacolod City, and Metro Cebu water districts was to publish newsletters on the impacts of climate change. Newsletters that would go out to staff and customers. Another one was to work with LGUs and NGOs to support climate-related awareness-raising initiatives such as tree planting activities, public seminars. That was mentioned by a couple of water districts. Then in that second circle, which is the assessment, Dasmariñas and Baliwag water districts mentioned that they're analyzing hazards and operational risks as part of their water safety plan, monitoring and allocating funds for system improvements. Another one that was mentioned was assessing ground and surface water availability and flow and vulnerability against saltwater intrusion and other risks. That was mentioned by Bacolod City and Puerto Princesa City water districts. Next slide, please. In terms of planning, Baguio City Water District mentioned that they're working with the LGU to adjust the water supply rationing scheme based on groundwater assessment results. So looking at how much groundwater is available and what's anticipated to happen in the near future due to climate change, and then adjusting the rationing scheme. The second was collaborating with LGUs and city councils to pass ordinances on septic management. That's being looked into by Isabela City, and Dumaguete City Water District has done it several years ago, I believe in, I think it was 2005 that they passed their ordinance. In terms of actions, implementing water loss reduction programs was mentioned by Legazpi City and Butuan City Water Districts. Integrating watershed conservation into performance indicator frameworks and policies was mentioned by Metro Naga, and launching reforestation efforts in watershed areas and working with local farmers to preserve watersheds has been done in Butuan City. And implementing flood protection measures to protect water treatment plants and pumping stations has been done in Camanatuan. So next slide, please. I want to mention a few points about the regional survey and mention some commonalities between the regional survey and the Philippines so we can kind of put it in context with the rest of Asia. So the regional survey had similar objectives and methodology. We had 14 respondents, 13 from Asia and 1 from Australia. And it included both water supply utilities and wastewater operators. It was conducted from February to April 2012, and we had an inception workshop and then a results validation and training workshop last May. So the key findings, next slide please. The key findings of the regional survey were that only 2 of the 14 were in an advanced stage of readiness. That was Australia and Singapore, which is not too surprising. But most of the others were in the intermediate phase of readiness. 7 have already integrated climate change into their ongoing risk identification and mitigation processes. And the top 5 perceived climate-related risks were very similar to the ones I mentioned for the Philippines, but they also added a concern about water quality impacts of climate change. And they didn't mention a concern about having limited or not enough information on climate change. So they seem to be a little more advanced in terms of understanding the climate science and impacts. And they mentioned that when they're in a situation where they have very limited data and resources, that they're doing scenario planning. Scenario planning is where you kind of make certain assumptions and you look at different scenarios for different situations. So if we have a major flood that reaches this level, this is how we can respond. Or if we're going to have, a 5-year drought, how are we going to deal with that? So coming up with different scenarios is a way of dealing with, not having really accurate data about what's going to happen. You can kind of make up different scenarios. And they emphasize the importance of partnerships. I think the theme we have today, and UN has for the years, water coordination. And partnerships is a very important part of that. They've found that working with their peers, other water utilities, also with the scientific community, sharing good practices and building capacity was a really very important way of trying to deal with climate change issue. Next slide, please. So some of the common findings between the Philippine and regional survey was overall, even though there are a lot of actions being taken already, overall there's a low level of awareness of basic climate science and how this will actually impact operations. So there's a real need to increase that understanding. There's limited access to tools and systems and technologies to identify risks and vulnerabilities and integrate climate factors into the planning processes. So we need to focus more on that. There's also limited access or lack of confidence in existing data and low capacity to analyze them meaningfully for planning and actions. I don't know how many of you are familiar with climate projections, but they're notoriously inaccurate. You can look at 5 different climate models, say 30 years from now, what is the temperature going to be in the Philippines, or what is the rainfall going to be in a certain area, and you'll get 5 different answers from these 5 different models. So that's an area of frustration for people working in this field. They also, there was a commonality between the two surveys on the lack of coordination between agencies and regions in sharing information and in managing water resources. We have a big job to do to increase coordination and joint planning of water resources management. And they also cited a very weak linkage between disaster risk reduction and practices that would build climate resilience. So we need to build that up. And as I mentioned, the no regrets actions were very common and could be a good starting point to contribute to building climate resilience and strengthening adaptive capacities. Next slide. So overall, the recommendations, which are stemming from some of the issues raised in the last slide, was there's a real need for water districts to reach out to the scientific community, so academe, Pagasa, Manila Observatory, and also NGOs that are active in this area, so the water districts can get more assistance, so they can better understand climate change science, the impacts, and how this can impact their operations. Develop and implement approaches for assessing vulnerabilities to climate change. So learning about how to use some of the tools that are available to do that. And engage stakeholders in the planning process. Climate change is a new issue, and the more we can involve, local government units, NGOs, academe in our areas, the better we'll be able to plan, and we'll be able to get them on board if they're involved with the planning process and they understand the issues that we're facing. It also comes down to tariffs as well, right? If we're going to have to make more investments in climate-proofing infrastructure or getting new water sources, that's going to mean an increase in tariffs. And in order to have public acceptability for those water tariffs, people need to understand the reason for it. So involving them in the planning process and having them understand the issues is the best way to get public support for tariff increases. Including climate change factors in no regrets and disaster risk reduction actions is very important. And one suggestion that we got from the U.S. and we're trying to replicate here is establishing a community of practice. So water districts can get together and discuss these issues and share, common challenges and solutions. The way they've done it in the U.S. is they've built an organization called Water Utility Climate Action. I can't remember what the A is. It's WUCA, W-U-C-A. And they get together on a regular basis. They talk on the phone once a month. And they have a website. They have some papers, resources that they have on their website. Because, they're all facing similar challenges, and it's a new, difficult area. So they found that by just discussing the issues amongst themselves, they're able to really understand them better and tackle them easier. So we've been talking with PAWAD about having a discussion forum on their website where water utilities that are getting into climate change adaptation could have some discussions online, and also some regular meetings and share resources. So if that's something you're interested in, let PAWAD know or let me know, and that's something that we're working on. So that's basically what I wanted to share with you today. So thank you very much.